listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and check us out online at beardedtheologians.com. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold. And today, as we continue our series on Lent, we have a very special guest with us. We have the Reverend Neal Christie, who works with the Board of Church and Society as the Associate General Secretary, leading up education and leadership formation. And that's a fun mouthful. Neal, we're so glad to have you with us. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, Zach. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you to both of you, to Zach and Matt, for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really looking forward to this. This is my first time doing this kind of a dialogue conversation. And so this is really fun for me. So I appreciate it. A little bit of background about myself. So I'm a Methodist elder. I was ordained in the Greater New Jersey Conference and served churches there for a number of years in rural churches, 2-point charges with cows on one side, alfalfa on the other. So I've never served in an urban church or larger urban church. I was a hospital chaplain in a trauma hospital for over a year in New Brunswick, New Jersey, connected to Rutgers University. Most of my patients were, it was blood disorders, so dialysis, tuberculosis, AIDS, HIV. And I'd done some urban ministry, some prison ministry before coming to Church and Society. In a way, for me, it was coming full circle. I was an intern here when I was in college. And back in 1980, doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it was a while back. It's 1985. And that led to another internship. I got some exposure to the general church, the connectional church, but I didn't feel called to it. When I went to seminary, I was interested in studying law and social ethics. I felt called to ordained ministry, especially to the administration of the sacraments. And the sacraments is a means of grace and connecting people to justice. And so for me, that's what brought me to local church ministry. But then I thought further, and I was discerning further where I felt called, and I literally did get called by Church and Society, asked me to apply for a position. They had my name from, I guess, years before. And so for 6 years, I directed our program called the United Methodist Seminar Program on National International Affairs, which is this experiential education. So it's all participatory, popular style education on social justice issues, where we design seminars based on where the group is at and taking them where they are. And so everything from immigration to hunger and homelessness, working with the unhoused, working around addictions issues, and creating educational programming. My colleague, Jim Winkler, became the general secretary. After he became the general secretary at that time, he made me one of the assistant general secretaries. And our general secretary, Susan Henry Crow, has maintained me in that position. So I've been here through actually 3 general secretaries, and have expanded some of my work. So it is a mouthful. Education, leadership, formation. My staff and I, my colleagues and I, the interns I'm blessed to work with, we do a lot of things. So we work with our seminar program. I oversee that. I oversee our all our internship programs and our internship staff. Our work in the central conferences in Africa, the Philippines, and in Europe, Eurasia, Russia. And increasingly, I spend time educating on the social principles in university settings outside the United States. I regularly at Africa University, regularly teaching in our seminary in Moscow, and then in the Far East and in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and in the Philippines. So I do a lot of global work on education, and priority for me right now is the revision of the social principles, which is a process that began actually 8 years ago, but was reaffirmed at General Conference in 2016. And so that's a long process. So the document that we're talking about today may not look the way it does in another 2-3 years. And I hope it doesn't. I'm hoping that there's some changes that they'll be accepted by General Conference. But my heart is in seeing how people of faith, United Methodists, and our ecumenical sisters and brothers approach document like the social principles and the values that we affirm, as a community. So I get to kind of create quite a bit. My responsibilities are pretty clear, but I'm very, very, very privileged, and I've given a lot of freedom to kind of explore new relationships and to see where the Spirit will lead the agency. So we have great colleagues here: civil and human rights, peace with justice, healthcare, gender justice, children's advocacy. I get to work with sort of all of our colleagues. I'm not to work with one portfolio. And then finally, I work with the racial ethnic caucuses in the United Methodist Church. So whether it's the Native American Caucus or Black Methodist for Church Renewal, or Marcha, working with Latino Caucus, I work to support their justice ministries as well. So that's a general overview of what I get to do.
Wow. So as you have a lot on your plate in a sense of a job, as you think about these social principles, like if you had to put them in a nutshell to explain to somebody who wasn't a part of the Methodist Church, or maybe a cradle Methodist that never heard about the social principles,
Sure.
what would you share with the person?
So if you were a cradle Methodist, I'd say, okay, where did you learn your principles? Like, who did you learn your first principles from? Was it did you learn from a parent, a grandparent? If you're a churchgoer, from a Sunday school teacher, a neighbor, where did you learn about right from wrong, good from bad, what's better from worse? And were there times in your life where you had a firm conviction or a belief that was challenged and you began to change your mind? And the fact that you changed your mind changed your attitude and your behaviors? Well, that's what the social principles in part are about. I mean, the social principles are a public expression of our personal faith. I might argue our faith is never private, so it's intensely personal, but it's also intensely public. So the social principles are social. They have to do with how we live out our personal faith in a social context. I would say that they are the best thinking of the General Conference of the United Methodist Church for this time, recognizing that our opinions will adapt, they will change based on the circumstances. An example would be arguments around divorce. The United Methodist Church was formed in 1968 to 1972. We had a very firm position on divorce, where we're quite condemnatory. And you can see in our social principles how language around human relationship, marriage, and then certainly divorce has changed with our theological understanding, our experience, and the cultures that we live in. So our position on divorce at this point is I'd argue, a very pastoral approach to understanding relationship. It's theologically grounded, but ultimately it's a pastoral approach to it. I'd say that the social principles are they're an outgrowth of our social creed, which was written in 1908, the first social creed, and then adopted again by subsequent general conferences, where we talk about the primacy of economic justice, where we talk about the role of women in society, safeguarding the health and welfare of women. This is a direct quote from that 1908 social creed. Because women are at the center of society. If we don't look at the health and welfare of women, we will not really be able to maintain the social fabric. So putting an end to child labor, guaranteeing one day in 7 is a Sabbath day. Thank God for us. But the Methodists are what brought us the weekend. We didn't have a weekend. We didn't really care very much about child labor as a society. Some of us did. But the social principles articulated those beliefs and those practices that will be part of our faith. And how do we express them in the public square? So I think their positions around belief. They also tell us something about how we belong. So when you look at the social principles, you see that they're separated into 6 different distinct sections that are oftentimes intersectional. You've got the natural world, the nurturing community, the social community, the political community, the economic community, and world community. And in each one, it's not just about what we believe or how we ought to behave. They also say something about what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be a human person with inherent dignity, right? And what is it, regardless of the culture, regardless of our social status, how do you belong in community? And when I think about that, when I think about the social principles as statements of belief, statements of behavior, and statements of belonging, it leads me to understand, well, okay, here's this document that is an outgrowth of the 1900 Social Creed, really written in 1972, has been adapted, edited each quadrennium, every 4 years until 2016. So we have this document. Well, what does it mean? What's the relevance for cradle Methodists that are in Oklahoma or California or New Jersey or in Kinshasa or in Manila? And I want to share with you that there's not one from my perspective, there's not one United Methodist that the social principles are written to. We have 12.8 million members in the church. We have 50 of the delegates that approve these social principles every 4 years. 58% come from the United States, 30% come from Africa, 4.6% come from Europe, and 5.8% come from the Philippines. And so there's not one United Methodist. And yet, while we sing different hymns, while we read scripture differently, our liturgies may adapt to culture, we have one set of social principles. For all these millions of United Methodists living across culture, across continent, different social, geographic histories, it is fascinating to me. It's a miracle of the church in some ways that we have one set of social principles. I mean, the only other church that comes close to something like that is the Catholic Church, which is the only global church with Catholic social teaching. Difference is that tends to be reserved not for the clergy, not for the laity. Social principles were written predominantly by the laity. They're voted on predominantly by the laity. That was the first social principle. So it's a fascinating document as a whole, even without going into the specifics of what's covered or not covered. The fact that they even exist to me is really, frankly, a small miracle. 2016, 2018, General Conference approving them. 2018 today, when you've got, churches that split, new emergent communities, charismatic churches that grow. The fact that we have one social principles to me is nothing short of a miracle. It really.
Right. Oh, go ahead. Well, and that's really kind of my question. We have enough culture shift and different cultures just within the United States, and you deal with this on a global level. As you said, we really are a global church, and so how do you approach that when you go to the Philippines, which they're a little more Western, I know that, but maybe even Eurasia and Africa, when you go to these places that don't, we can't see eye to eye on culture here, but when it's so much different culture-wise, and we bring this one set of social principles in, how do we begin to work within that, not only on a cultural level here in the States, but on a global level?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll give you an example. I was in Angola a few years ago, and Bishop Gaspar Domingos, he's the bishop there, and he's a younger bishop. At the time he was, he had just turned 40. So he was a fairly young bishop. And he said to me, and I was doing a training for all the clergy in the conference. So there were maybe 300 or 400 clergy in the room. And he said to me before we began, he said, Neal, remind them of what it means to be a United Methodist. And I said, Bishop, what do you mean by that? And he said, they are being tempted to go in every kind of direction there is. All the new church growth schemes that we think about in the United States, it's there, right? You've got, again, charismatic movements that are growing, but that begin a church, but they don't ever complete a church. May begin a community, but the community disintegrates. It doesn't hold together. He said, we have a distinct Wesleyan heritage that is personal and public. And I want you to reaffirm that even as you talk about the social principles. Be proud of the history we have. And and say these are distinctly united marks of Methodism. Social principles are one of the marks of what it means to be a United Methodist. So I'll never forget that, because it was important for him to, and I've heard this from other bishops in Africa, is like, this is our contribution. This is part of what makes us distinctly United Methodist. They've said the same thing in Switzerland and in Austria, where we're a minority church, where we have several thousand members, but not compared to the Catholic or Lutheran Church. We're the non-state church, right? And so how do we approach these other larger churches with a particular identity? The social principles are how we do it. Now, how do you make the social principles relevant in a particular in a given context? I think the way that I do that, it depends on the situation. If we are in the Philippines, there'll be I think a significant interest in issues like, because of the realities in the Philippines right now, and the church is facing these realities with a very strong president where there is extrajudicial killings or targeting of the press and religious leaders who don't support many of the government policies. There is conflict between Muslims and Christians, and so especially in the Muslim South and the Christian North and Middle Part Islands. There is deep poverty. There is rapid development, economic development, the effects of free trade. Climate justice, climate change is a reality that every small community is dealing with. So it's not some abstraction. You have entire communities being washed away because of dramatic shifts in climate and the number of typhoons that increased over the past decade. So you have a large migrant community that brings money back home, but who are located in parts of the Middle East and in North Africa and the United States, and they're dependent upon those jobs for their economy, to keep the economy back home in Philippines intact. So these are some of the social realities they're dealing with. So we're very conscious when we teach the social principles. What's your reality? What are you living with? And then the benefit of the social principles is it doesn't deal with like one issue from in a sense, a globalized perspective. It breaks it down. It looks at the parts. So if we look at the natural world section of the social principles, people can relate to it. They can relate to it because it talks about climate justice. It talks about food justice and food security. We ask people to identify what are the positions of the church that they would affirm, they would agree with or not agree with. We ask them to look at whose interests the social principles reflect. Do they reflect their interests? If they don't reflect their interests, whose interests do they reflect? We ask them questions like the values in the social principles. What are the values that are lifted up in the social principles? And are they values things like hospitality, dignity, justice, love, which I'd say is a value, honesty. What are the values that are relevant in a specific social principle? And then we look at where the social principle seeks to meet a human need or a need in God's creation. And so we ask these kinds of questions, and then we will, again, based on people's experience, we see how they enter into dialogue with the text. So that's one way that I begin. And then, of course, we look at the biblical pieces. We look at, if we're looking at the natural world, of course, we're going to look at Genesis. We're going to take a look at what it says in Revelation, what it says in some of the epistles around creation. We look at John Wesley, and we look at Methodist care for creation over the generations. Ultimately, we want to get people to the point where they look at the text, they look at the context of the text, they look at their own context, and then they decide, well, now what? Where do I find myself encouraged? Where do I see the church walking with me to some form of action, leading to some action? Why do I say that? Every social principle has within it not only a position, a value, a set of interests that it represents, a set of needs it seeks to meet, but it has some call to action. When you look closely at the social principles, you'll see that it doesn't sort of just leave you there explaining the problem. No, it will either give you a prophetic action, point of action, a pastoral way of action that's more therapeutic in nature, a problem-solving way of acting in the world. And it depends on the issue. It really depends on the issue. If you take one social principle, it'll take you in one direction, another, it'll take you another. Our position on reproductive health, on abortion, I think is a very pastoral approach. If you look at the death penalty, very different issue having to do with decisions in human life, though. The death penalty is a position that really is one that's not it's pastoral, yes, but it goes in the direction of prophetic. It's not. It's going to be a little bit different than the way we approach the issues around abortion or around, let's say, what's another one that I would say, or sexual assault. That's the one I just opened up on. Each social principle will have a different way of calling us to act and respond to the realities of the world. And not every social principle will have an identical form of action, but they will all have a set of values, a set of interests, a set of needs, and a distinct position that the church has taken, that they hold in common. And outside the United States, I think the challenge really is understanding the geography and understanding that history and the realities of that community. In the Congo, for example, and the Congo's in the news now partly because of the President Kabila arguments whether or not he'll run for a third term. There have been riots in the streets. The Catholic Church is quite outspoken. United Methodists have been involved in this as well. There are a number of refugees and displaced persons, and they've now moved into eastern part of Africa, and you have issues around of tribal conflicts that are occurring. You have persons who have very different racial, ethnic identities coming into contact with one another. In the Congo, you have a situation of conflict between pygmies in the church and people who come from a Bantu ethnic group. People don't think about this, but this is a serious reality. How do you create equity amongst these groups? Well, you can talk about equity, you can talk about reconciliation, you can talk about recovery from violence, and we do that as Ministries for Church and Society, but the social principles sort of give us the language by which we can talk about those realities. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It gives us language that's common language, rather than our approaching the issue based on our own experience. It gives us some common language. And knowing that it goes beyond my own experience, but it connects me to a larger world community is liberating for many people who realize I'm not alone in this. I am not alone when it comes to sexual assault. I am not alone when it comes to issues of alcohol and drug abuse. I am not alone when it comes to living with AIDS, HIV, or struggling for a living wage and collective bargaining. Those are issues that span the globe. They span the globe. We may not always agree on them, but they're not isolated issues. They're ones that we can find ourselves in. And I think that for me, when I'm working with groups outside the United States especially, is helping them to find themselves in this text. And they realize then, wow, this is part of my United Methodist DNA. This is who I am. And it shows me a way forward.
Man, I think that's the best example and conversation about the social principle I have ever heard.
Right?
And now it's like, it's totally changed the way I always view them,
Right.
and the way that I thought about them. And when you were talking about one, I went and just read one. I was like, wow, I never saw that before. The parts that you said about it. And I'm just like, wow, I wish I would have heard that in seminary.
Right?
You would have wanted to take it more seriously.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's the deal. Is it like, I remember sitting in a conversation a few years ago with a bishop in a congregation, and it was over the issue of immigration, and the bishops had basically, social principles to the T. It was a great explanation, a great thing. And I'll never forget the older man standing up in the room and saying, I've been a United Methodist my whole life, and I've never knew that we believe this, and I don't know if I can be this way. And at that moment, that's when it hit me that these social principles are so important for our congregations to get their hands on and to get to know. And it's not, and I think that's been the whole tension, is that it's not church law, but it's a conversation and a dialogue that can help us grow and stretch our faith. And then when you added that global context onto it just blew my mind in a way that, like, wow, I never thought, it didn't dawn on me that this whole conversation is brought to the world table. I just assumed it was kind of one of those deals like we've done in the past, where it's like, no, you'll just accept this as it is, and you're going to just take what we have to say about it and go from there. But to have that dialogue of broadening the horizons of the conversations of the social principles, it just makes it even bigger and huge. That it's not just an American thing, that this is right. that our social principles are a global thing. And as I was looking at, the one I looked at in particular was on gambling. And it was just like, wow, that's an impact on my community, and how do we respond to that? How can we talk about that? And I just like I was listening to this, like, man, this has to be the best conversation I've ever heard on the social principles ever. And this has to get out there. And I'm not just saying it for our benefit, but I'm just thinking, man, like, more churches need to hear what you have just offered us, that are United Methodists, to hear why these things are important. And I think that would, that might make an impact in our communities, and it may even, crack, some people may actually may buy the book, from Cokesbury, or, go to their pastor's office and steal their book of discipline, and look at those for a change, and who knows what it may do. And that was kind of like our whole deal with this podcast for Lent, is that we wanted to raise an awareness of this, so that way people can stretch and grow their faith. And it's not just something, it's one whole thing to like know the facts and to know the theology behind it, but when we can look at that why and that bigger, like, wow, like, I never, like, just thinking about what you had said about the principles and what they have in them, like that change, that's a game changer for me.
It is.
Good.
My job is done.
Done my job. I mean, even when I'll give you an example, and I don't think they were conscious when they did this, when they wrote it, when the first principles were written, or when the when some of this was written, I don't think it was really, honestly, it was just not conscious on their part. Because if you look at even let me see where it's at, if it's in the preamble to the social principles or not, but you'll see, okay, yeah, it is actually it's in the preface, where it says the social principles, well, as you said, while not considered church law, are a prayerful and thoughtful effort on the part of the General Conference to speak to human issues in a contemporary world from a sound biblical and theological foundation, as historically demonstrated in United Methodist traditions. It's a mouthful. It's a long sentence. But whoever wrote it, and I have a sense of who wrote that one, it brings up the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And that's something I want to make sure that we don't lose in the conversation, is that one sentence in the preface. It says the social principles, while not considered church law, are a prayerful and thoughtful effort, so reason, right, on the part of the General Conference to speak to human issues in a contemporary world, experience, that's experience, from a sound biblical and theological foundation, so scripture, third part of the quadrilateral, contemporary world from a sound biblical and theological foundation as historically demonstrated in United Methodist traditions, so tradition. So even in the preface, it's there. It's there. It's almost doing the exegesis necessary, right? If you do the exegesis, it's not just sort of, it's like, there are times we need to take the social principle at face value, okay? And we absolutely ought to. On suicide, when I'm working with a group of 13-year-olds in our chapel, confirmation kids, who come in and I'm doing a game called Agree, Disagree. And I say, I'm going to read a social principle, ask you if you agree with it. If you don't agree with it, move here. If you agree with it, over here. And I got 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds saying to me, I read our social principle on suicide that nothing, quoting Romans, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. We do not condemn persons who have committed suicide, taken their own. And I asked them, how many of you know someone's tried to commit suicide? And you got 2/3 of their hands going up, of 13-year-olds who don't know me, but who are honest enough in the context of our chapel during a game on the social principles, during a confirmation class, to say, this is a reality that my friends and I live through. We need to know what the church actually does say. We absolutely must. We need to teach it because it's distinct from other church traditions. That's true in the United States. It's absolutely true in Africa, where there's more shame and stigma. I won't say more, but there is significant shame and stigma still applied to those who take their life, contemplate suicide. But that's one example where the language really does matter. Those specific words, I would argue, really matter. However, the majority of the social principles, we need to go a little bit further. We need to unpack because they're not as cut and dry. If you look at social principle, for example, on another one where it is cut and dry would be, I would argue, is on things like bullying. Those things have to do with interpersonal power relationships, violence, issues of violence and violation. They're very clear. There's sort of the do's and the don'ts. But where it's less clear is, I think, around issues like the family or around culture and identity, or around, even in terms of the natural world, water, air, soil, minerals, plants. It says we affirm these things, but it doesn't say now, well, this is how you're going to live that out. And I think that's part of the reason why we've got a revision of the social principles. We want more clarity in terms of, well, what's the next step? Now, what's the call to action? I don't know. It depends on which section you're looking at, but there's a time to exegete them, and there's a time to, from my perspective, to take them to celebrate this is the position of the church. And then there are times to critique them. And I don't want to lose the opportunity to say, to critique some of the social principles that I personally do question, and I wonder how healthy they are. I mean, our position around war and peace, the military, seems as if we're we're looking at both sides, but we're not necessarily saying, well, this is where the church stands. Issues around human sexuality, I think, are ambiguous in many places because we affirm human rights on the one hand and civil rights on the other. But then over here, we condemn people based on their identity and the relationships they're in. There's this ambiguity needs to be reconciled. There are places in the social principles where we say grace is something. Grace is actually a word that's used frequently in the social principles theologically. What do we even mean by grace? How do we understand grace? We don't go into the detail, perhaps, that we need to. So there's a role for clergy and laity to take a look at the theological language that's in here and to unpack it further, because it's not enough to simply read them. That said, I will give you another example. I was serving a church where my chair, the chair of our trustees, was much more traditional than I was, more conservative politically. And he said, he always loved the social principles. And he said, even when I disagree with them, we need to have them available in the narthex of the church, along with all the other literature that represent the United Methodist Church. And I said, great, we'll do it. So I put them in the pews, and during a wedding, which I officiated at, with someone who was Catholic and someone who was Methodist, I found like 150 social principles were gone. They took them. It's like all these Catholics are, all these Methodists are, and I'm thinking to myself, so as soon as my church trustees found out, he was like, Neal, you need to get more social principles because we have to always have them available in the pews. I have heard stories of people going door to door, and this is the truth. A Korean-American colleague who was building a new church, starting a new church, and going door to door, they talk about their church, and they would bring the social principles with them. and they would hand them out in Korean because they knew in the community they were working in, which was a struggling economic community, that a lot in here around economic justice and around migration and around issues of race and racial justice would appeal to them. And so they didn't hide from them. They weren't shy. They said, this is who we are. If you understand our hymnody, if you understand our approach towards scripture, and you're going to read the Bible, you understand our polity and how we build community together. Well, this is our ethics. These are our theological ethics. This is how we try to form people theologically and ethically. And they didn't hide it. So, yeah.
Well, and going off that, you told that story when we were there just a couple of weeks ago. You shared that wedding story with us. And Melissa, my colleague from Montana, that was there with me, we talked about that. And we really, coming home, it's like, what can we do? We're in a huge state. We're about to begin a huge conference.
Yeah.
How do we work within our context and bring some of this back? And we kind of jumped off with that idea of, what if we get at least one copy, if not multiple copies, in the pews of every Methodist church in Montana, just to have them available and there, so that people can look at them and grab onto them. Because I believe that presence is a big part of what we do, and simply having the social principles present, like you say, opens up the door for opportunity. And so that we're kind of jumping off that idea, and what does this look like? And going off of that idea of presence, I want to maybe shift gears a little bit, but not too much, but talk about your physical presence,
okay,
where you're actually located there on Capitol Hill, because I think it's beautiful. But there's some things you do with your presence there, with your sign outside, and then physically with what you guys do on campus or on Capitol Hill.
Right. So thank you. So the location here, and I'll give you a little bit of background, is the United Methodist Building. It's the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. So if you go online and you see a picture of us, what it doesn't show necessarily, it really doesn't show, is the proximity to the Capitol. That you can walk 5 minutes actually 2 minutes in any direction, and you'll be in a governmental building. So to my left, when I look out my window, is the United States Senate. Looking at it right now. Right behind my head is the United States Capitol. So I can go to the Capitol in 5 minutes. The United States Supreme Court is over here in front of me. So we were built before the United States Supreme Court was built, 1923. The Supreme Court was built in 1935. It was built for several reasons. Number one, 1920s, we were talking about the right for women to vote, and making sure that the right for suffrage was practiced and ensured state by state. Child labor issues, turn of the century, for those first decades, was a priority for us. It still is a priority for us. Issues around temperance, and the growing temperance movement was there, as distinct from prohibition. The Methodist Church really wasn't prohibition. It was more about temperance. How do we look at the root causes of and the access to addictive, distilled spirits, so alcohol, and the effects of alcohol addiction on the family, especially migrant families coming from Europe. And then gambling was another issue. And then prize fighting, which most people forget about. Prize fighting still on the books for United Methodist women. So the building was built by dollars and small donations from everywhere from Kansas to Missouri, all over the country. People were, Sunday school classes, Bible studies, were willing to give to these causes, recognizing that we needed a place that would address issues around the language at the time was public morals, and not just one issue, but the many issues that the church needed to be in the public square. So it's a really unique location. I mean, it's amazing. You've got. We're also we play a hospitable presence, to use the language of presence, to many different groups. In this building, you won't only find the General Board of Church and Society, the General Commission on Religion and Race, You'll also find the National Council of Churches. You'll find the Franciscans have an office here. You will find the Islamic Society for North America, so most of the community here. You'll find our Jewish sisters and brothers. Reformed Judaism has a building right next door to us. The Lutheran Church, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, Episcopal Church are all in this building. So what began as a particular United Methodist presence to Capitol Hill in a tumultuous time of growing immigration, growing social challenges, oppressive realities that the church wanted to respond to. It's maintained that, but moved beyond that to be much more inclusive in terms of our vision of peace with justice and wholeness, that we know that we can't do it alone. We need to do it ecumenically. We need to do it interfaith. And so we welcome many people into this building. The original issues that the building was built on, child labor, temperance, suffrage, is now expanded. So environmental justice, issues of civil and human rights. Dr. King in the 1960s, the March on Washington, organized out of this building with the help of the National Council of Churches and our agency. This was a segregated city. So how are you going to organize something like a March on Washington? Using payphones, which is what he did. Where's the porta potty go? Who's going to be on which part of the agenda? It's like, how do you get these thousands of people moving? So these things that we take for granted for these historical, monumental movements in history, anti-nuclear movement, liberation movements in Latin America, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, all had some support and presence in this space. They had presence in this space. Haiti, Father Aristide, the first democratically elected president of Haiti, who was in exile, found a space here in this building so that he could work with other exilees for democracy in Haiti. So Washington Office on Latin America, my friend Joe Eldridge, who ran that, ended up becoming the chaplain for American University after being a missionary Latin America, in Chile, in other hot spots in Central America and Latin America. Realized it was not enough for him to do the work there with the people. He had to represent them here where policies are being made. So he founded the Washington Office on Latin America. So in a sense, it's that ministry of presence is probably our greatest gift of the church to our global society. It really is. And it was a very conscious decision that has been maintained for many generations now. So this is 1923 when it was built. This is 2018. If you go in front of our building, there's a sign there. And so on the one hand, you'd have people going talking with legislators, having legislators meet with us here, looking at citizen groups that are coming to the building, education work here. But then the physical presence itself lends itself to re-imaging what the church stands for. What do I mean by that? So you gave a great example in our sign on the front of the building. Senator Cory Booker loves our sign. So senator from New Jersey, outspoken on immigration issues. He loves to retweet or tweet and then retweet like our sign, because it'll say, all immigrants are human beings. All immigrants are deserving of dignity. Healthcare is a human right. And to see that in front of a building, which doesn't look like a church, but when you see the sign saying United Methodist, you realize, but it's owned by, that it says related to a church, is a powerful witness. And there's not a day that goes by when I'm not looking out the window when someone is taking a picture of themselves in front of the Methodist building. Right. Because I don't even know if they're Methodist. They could be Baptist for all I care. It doesn't matter to me. Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist. But they feel some sense of an affinity, a connection. If they're a person of faith and they see that and they're like, wow, this is another example would be last year at Lent. My colleague Jeannie Aree, who works on civil and human rights issues, major focus for us is on mass incarceration and the death penalty. So she arranged for the Methodist building to be one of the Stations of the Cross in Washington, D.C. And so there was an artist based out of London who was working with other nonprofits to create public spaces for Stations of the Cross. And he wanted this to be the first one on this, of the stations. And so what an artist did was, we secured an artist from the Children's Defense Fund, which does advocacy on favor of children, the needs of children, started by Mary Wright Edelman, long-term advocate for kids, and a gentleman who had been incarcerated, I believe, for 22, 23 years on death row, and then was exonerated. He was found innocent. He didn't commit the crime. The DNA showed it. He had become an artist while he was incarcerated. He began working with the Children's Defense Fund. And what he did is he created life-size images of people, of sort of mannequins wearing orange jumpsuits, and placed them across our lawn and in front of our building with the statistics of how many people are incarcerated, how many people are on death row in the United States. Oklahoma, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah, we're number one in that.
More women than anywhere else in the world,
yep.
Right? So this is a challenge we have. This is our common challenge. We all should. And in other countries, when they look at us, they wonder what is going on that perpetuates this. They wonder. So all during Lent, we had these folks in these different positions, some with their arms outstretched like this, no faces, but wearing jumpsuits like this, some lying flat like this, and the statistics and showing how many people are incarcerated by state, how many people are on death row, how many people have been exonerated. We're finding more and more people are exonerated that are that should not have been on death row. And it was a public witness. It was a real public witness to stand in solidarity with all people who are suffering from a system that is broken, a mass incarceration system that is broken, and certainly those who are being executed by the state. A position, the United Methodist social principles are very clear that we oppose the death penalty. We believe that it denies the possibility for reconciliation. It denies the possibility for, by giving the power to the state, denies the possibility for reconciliation between God and persons. And it's not the answer, not the answer. So here was a public expression. Another one is right before Christmas during Advent, when the argument around the Dreamers and the DREAM Act was coming to the floor of Congress. We had an organization that does art, sort of installation art, called Inside Out, take pictures of people, blow them up like 4 feet wide on sort of rice paper and plaster them on our Methodist building. And so you could go and say, oh, that's Bishop so-and-so, that's so-and-so, there's Neal. And it said, I'm a dreamer too. We're all dreamers. We're all dreamers. So you look around, the Methodist building was wrapped with faces, larger than life, all different people, just like the three of us. And we recognize our common humanity. We recognize that we all are dreamers, that it's not about scapegoating a particular group of people, and that we need to look deeper into the issue around immigration and a broken immigration system, and not vilify and scapegoat, especially young people who are, you know, who are migrants. So we try to use the space in creative ways like that. Another example I'll give you, and this is sort of the inside of the building. I remember a year or two ago, a group of Buddhist monks had walked across the United States, and they were walking for peace. And they ended in our chapel for a prayer service. And I remember helping lead the service with them. And they were there with their saffron robes, and I thought, only in the Methodist, where else will they find this hospital? I hope they'll find it in Methodist churches, but in lieu of a Methodist church on Capitol Hill, this is a place that's hospitable for them, where they are welcome to come and pray for peace, especially in the regions of the world where they represented. And they had come peacefully marching across the country. And they found their final home not in a Buddhist temple, or a sanctuary, but in the Methodist building. And I'll never forget that our goal at that moment was to show them deep hospitality and welcome. So I think these are the things that are possible in any United Methodist Church location, honestly. And that's my dream, is that with the number of local churches we have 43,000 local churches in the United Methodist Church. Even if 1% were to really expand their vision of what their public space can look like, even without doing anything, simply by how they represent themselves beyond the church sign, or inclusive of the church sign, but going further, what kind of a difference could we make,
Mm-hmm. Well, it's all about asking ourselves that question that you asked earlier on of how do we belong in this community, and do we give people the opportunity to have dignity? Do we bring dignity to the community with us? And that's what these social principles cause us to do, or should cause us to do, is ask that question. How do we belong, and how do we do it with dignity? Yeah. And that's huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
I was thinking, as you were talking, I was like, man, we just need to have you on for the rest of Lent.
Right.
Because you've done such a great job.
I talk way too much. I'm sorry.
No. Like, I was thinking, like, man, we're starting, our second week is with Neal, and like, I don't know if it can get any better than this, right? On that same time. And I was like, man,
you will.
Can we have you back on? And I want to extend that invitation to you. Like, anytime you want to come back, or if there's something that you'd like to share with our listeners, we'd be glad to have you on at any time. And we thank you for your time, and we know that you've got a full schedule. And man, I feel like I didn't know I would expect to learn so much today, and I'm like, right. I'm really excited. And we thank you for your time, Neal. And anytime that you're more than welcome to come back anytime, and I extend that invitation to you. And we want to encourage our listeners. If you're not United Methodist, I would encourage you to at least glance at our social principles. And if you Google social principles, United Methodist Church, you'll find them very easily. And there's all sorts of ways to access those through our Global Board of Church and Society, and they're pretty easy to find. And so we encourage you to take a look at those and see where they call you to action, or see where you can say, yeah, I can hang my hat on that one, or maybe not that one, but let's have some dialogue on that. And maybe get the study that's in the back of the book there is a phenomenal group study, to have a group of people to gather and work through those together, and would encourage people in churches and small groups to look at that. Because we have a couple of small groups that actually listen to us and utilize us. And so we want to point you in that direction and loan that resource to you. And we wouldn't have been able to do all this without our listeners. And so we're thankful for you, and would encourage our listeners to go on whatever they listen to this on, whether it be Google Play or iTunes podcast thing, or whatever place that you listen to us. And there are many avenues in which this will be shared, and some that we know about and some that we don't know about. And we just encourage you to give us a good review and give us 5 stars, or whatever their system of good is. Make us look good. We'd encourage you to go to our website at beardedtheologians.com and pick up some Bearded Theologians gear that we have, and then look at some of our really cool blog posts that we have out there. We've got some really good blog posts on different topics, and I know we've got a couple on social principles coming. We've asked a couple of people to write for us in reflection about those, and so we're looking forward to sharing those with you. And we just give thanks for all of our listeners. And so, Neal, once again, I thank you for your time, and you're more than welcome to come back anytime. And so
I'll take you up on it.
Good.
I appreciate it. I really appreciate your hospitality. I do encourage people to take a look at, there may be one issue you're wondering. I'm wondering if the church says anything about this. Go to the social principles, and one issue may lead you to another, and you may see yourself reflected in it. You may not, and that's cool too. If you argue, you enter into a conversation, a dialogue, then I think they're doing their part, because it's through that dialogue and that conversation, that communication, that growth happens and conscientization happens. And so, I think this is a gift that we have to the church, but it's a gift that the church offers to the world in the social principles. And I want to thank you both for your hospitality and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I'll keep praying for you both and your listeners during this time of Lent, especially as we have much to mourn and recover from in terms of violence in our own communities, especially toward children. That's unacceptable and avoidable. And it's a truth that when I was in Ghana last week, I'll just share this with you if I may. I was with all our African bishops and then 160 district superintendents, like all the district superintendents for Africa. After the first half hour of introductions, they said, we need to stop because we need to pray. What happened in Florida and what's happening in the United States and the number of children who are being crucified, who are being killed in the schools in America. These are our sisters and brothers who are very conscious of what happens. Our eyes, they're watching us. The church is watching us. So how we approach it, these realities, because they're not issues, these are human realities, matters. And we are not so separate from one another. What happens in one part of the world absolutely does affect another. And the social principles are a way of, I think, reducing the distance between us. And the word has power. And so thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
So for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
And I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we hope that you share our content online through Facebook and social media, and we hope that you check out our Beardcast store at beardedtheologians.com and pick up some great Bearded Theologians gear. We hope you have a good day.